Welcome and thank you, Gianluigi, for joining us here on the Digital Markets Competition Forum for another conversation on research insights about key characteristics of the digital markets. But today we're going to talk more and mainly about digital firms. What's really intriguing about your latest research and publications was, some of the catchy words there that have been used also, particularly by venture capitalists, which is hyperscaling and hyperspecialization.
Yeah, so essentially these catchphrases, catchwords that you see in the manuscript reflect this observation that the biggest firms in terms of market capitalization, revenues, and intangible assets and whatnot are platforms. So the idea of the paper is really try to explain why is the dominant business model of the digital economy, why this dominant business model is in fact the business model of the platform. So why do we see scale and specialization? And this is interesting because generally we are used to think of large firms as firms that are vertically integrated. So there are some very important historical accounts of the evolution of the large-scale enterprise in the 20th century by Alfred Chandler, for instance, which is an historian from Harvard, that notices how the biggest corporations in the past used to be both very large in scale and very large in scope. So scope and scale used to go hand in hand. However, the big companies of today seem to adopt a different setup, right? So we see very large scale, but also more specialization. And this is kind of a fact that has been observed in several studies on superstar firms. And so I think the key insight of the paper, which is something that is not necessarily obvious, or at least it wasn't obvious to us when we started writing the paper, is that specialization is something that fosters scales. So resources or business models that are scalable, okay, they tend to do better if companies specialize in one thing, because by specializing and focusing on just one activity, the company can achieve scaling that activity faster. And therefore, the kind of the key insight here is that scale and specialization, when we're dealing with resources that create more value as the company grows larger, right? Especially in the realm of digital technology. So scale and specializations are two sides of the same coin. So
is this a staging strategy, meaning you start very focused, right, and very specialized in a set of activities, and then once you have achieved a particular scale, you also expand in terms of scope by, tapping into adjacent markets, different activities might seem, unrelated at first sight, but then, maybe these firms find a way to relate them, across the similar needs or of the user base.
Essentially, it is possible that once a company exhausts any room for growth, right, in one specific market, may have incentives to diversify or integrate along the value chain. Right? So that's totally possible. But the point that we're trying to make in the paper is that the limit, so the moment in which this kind of plateauing of growth is reached in the digital economy is essentially is farther away than it used to. So if we want to understand the difference between digital firms and non-digital firms, right? So we have to understand what are the kind of the key differences in practical terms. So there is a trade-off in the traditional settings, whereby if you want to increase revenues, you can either lower price and increase quantities, or increase prices and lower quantities. Now, in the digital economy, these trade-offs are a little bit different, meaning that, for instance, when we look at market size, digital goods essentially can be distributed globally at very little cost. And also because these companies generally enjoy network externalities, which you referred to earlier, it means that these companies don't have to lower the price of their goods and services as they grow larger. In fact, may actually increase the price of their goods and services because their products become more valuable as they grow. So this kind of key differences is what makes this company scale differently and behave differently. So it is possible that at some point, even the digital economy is going to exhibit some saturation, like, similar to the one that we see in physical goods. But again, the point of saturation is much farther away. So there are several elements that I think it's important to stress. So the first one is that, of course, our paper is not a theory of everything, so we cannot explain everything. The key message really is to focus on this particular difference, which is essentially how does scaling shape organizing? So how does scaling shape the type of organizational forms that we're going to see, right? So, and this is kind of one force among many, all right? So that's kind of one element of the paper, right? So there are other elements, other forces. So, it's a complicated picture. So, case by case, it's going to be very difficult to apply our theory to also digital economy. Now, the second point that is related to some of the questions about trade-offs that you mentioned earlier. So what I found very curious studying this topic, especially in the context of digital firms, digital startups, is that generally there is a debate between founders and VCs and so on what kind of activities should the corporation or the startup engage in, right? So, and because these companies deal with technologies that are general purpose, so when you have a machine learning technology, a platform, an algorithm, so these are typically resources that you can apply in many settings. The point of the paper is that even though the company, any company could do many things, it shouldn't do everything, right? So it should do the things where essentially scale drives this essential wedge between value creation and cost. So the point of digital technology is that these technologies create more value when the company operates at large scale. And this is because of network effects and economies of scale in software development. And therefore, focusing in the activities where the economies of scale are the strongest is the best way for these companies to grow, at least early on. Now, of course, at some point, the company may reach maturation, other things may be at play, and other things may happen. As far as the barriers to entry are concerned, right, that's something that we haven't studied much. Clearly, network effects and economies of scale are a powerful barrier to entry. Now, the question, though, is, does it make sense to have two big social networks? So do the users benefit from two big social networks, right? Or the users benefit from two very successful search engines? Now, if our theory is correct, right? So at least when it comes to price and quantities, okay? So generally, one concern with monopolies is that they restrict quantities and charge higher prices. Now, that concern the specific concern for digital companies and companies that enjoy huge economies of scale and scope, huge economies of scale and due to network effects and economies of scale in software development. So that specific concern is less important. And the reason why it's less important is because for these companies, volume, so the possibility to grow and reach very large scale, is more important than value capture. It's more important than charging high prices. Because the majority of revenues, right, come from having a very large user base. The majority of, so economies of scale kick in when a large user base is essentially operating on the platform. And for these reasons, the company tend not to charge very high prices. So if you want to, for instance, just to make the example of Uber, right? So if you want to have a lot of drivers, you have to make sure that the drivers on your platform are incentivized to join and get a good deal, right? So that kind of limits the ability of Uber to charge very high commissions to the drivers, for instance. Also, if it's very important for you, the working of the platform to have a lot of users, because that's how the drivers have very little downtime, and that's how so the value equation starts to kick in. Then the prices that you charge to the users shouldn't be very high, right? So because it's very important for the company to have a lot of users and a lot of drivers. So the idea is that digital firms create more value when they operate at large scale, meaning that because of the network effects and the economies of scale in software, the wedge between revenues and costs is the highest when these companies operate at very large scales. Now, if a company wants to operate at very large scales, it cannot charge high prices. It cannot charge, essentially extract value from the complementors, because if it does so, then the complementors will go to a competing platform. So because of these forces at play, the scaling potential of digital technologies essentially lowers the incentives of monopolies to increase prices and lower quantities, right? So that's kind of the key idea, right? So that if these companies make a lot of money because they're big, in order to be big, they have to charge lower prices. So it's a very kind of intuitive way to think about it. With that said, right, so if the concern of, let's say, of the regulator, of the policymaker is prices and quantities, then the scaling potential of these technologies, of digital firms, is such that essentially that concern of price and quantities shouldn't be there or shouldn't be particularly strong. That said, right, these companies may have create other type of issues when, let's say, they control information or they can steer matching of complementors and users in a way that favors them, quite strongly. So, concentration of economic activity in the hands of one agent is always risky. Right, so it depends on how we look at this. We look at this in terms of prices and quantities, then scaling clearly is a countervailing force, meaning that to the extent that these companies do well by operating on large scales, they have incentives to keep prices low. On the other hand, there are other issues, right? So that could be related to control of information, the way matching occurs, right, or transparency. So all those things are beyond the scope of the paper, of course, and there are reasons to believe that could be, those could be issues to write in from a policy standpoint.
Sometimes we might have excessive competitive environments to the point where the economics for quality, right, and differentiation are simply not there, right? I mean, and therefore there is competition is mainly on quantities, mainly on efficiency, mainly on low prices, and this might get us, lots of variety of things, but less of the, nice and higher distinct quality products. Might this be an artifact of the underlying economics?
Yeah, so one thing that I found very interesting studying these things, right? So there are different elements, right? One element is to what extent digital companies, right, so digital firms have more incentives to invest in quality, okay? And if these investments are fixed costs, so they're fixed, then they have more incentives to invest in quality because for them, the return on investment is much higher. So if you think about which operating system is best for navigating when you're driving in your car, right? So using, for the navigation of your car. Clearly, the one offered by Google and Apple is superior to the one offered by the car companies, right? Because they have fewer resources to invest in that specific application. So to the extent that quality is proportional, so it's a fixed cost. So investment in quality are fixed costs. These companies have more incentives, right? So they invest more. So the machine learning algorithm that Netflix uses, right? So Netflix has been a pioneer in machine learning. I was one of the biggest investors in content creation. They can afford these investments because they're big, right? So in the digital world, this is almost the opposite of what you see in the luxury industry or in other places. Quality and size go hand in hand. With that said, there are also some exceptions, right? So this is not in the paper, but I also study digital intermediaries in different guises, right? So one of the problems is that it's a lot more difficult to sell high value goods on a platform, simply because if you're paying a commission, the cost of a commission in percentage terms is much more substantial when you're selling a good that is high quality, right? So the cost of this, the benefits of this disintermediating are higher for high quality goods, for instance. Or it's a lot more difficult to sell goods that have little market. So there are other issues, right? But when we think about the infrastructure of the platform and the quality of the service that comes with the platform, which is typically a fixed cost, then these companies actually are in a better position to invest, because digital means essentially that the cost of replicating this fixed investment is zero. So the cost structure is all fixed cost, and therefore these companies have more incentives to invest because they're bigger.
This brings me, to some thinking, right? That what we observe, right? The digital economy, when we look particularly at the intermediaries, right? So the platforms, is that yes, we see, some platforms that are growing very big, right? And some of this, they're still fundamentally focusing on one specific activity. Now, the regulations of the Digital Markets Act, right? So it refers to this core platform services, right? So we still see that many of these companies are basically in one or few, right, of these core platform services, which speaks basically to the insights of your model, of your research, right? That they're still very specialized. Nonetheless, I mean, some of those are, generic platforms, right? I mean, social media platforms, right? Operating system, right? So they cuts across. But along this, we also observe that there are a number of platforms that are becoming very specialized, right? So they are very niche platforms that enters in very specific verticals that, that are covered, right, by other of these generalists, right? I mean, big platforms. I'm referring, for instance, platform for, restaurant booking, right? Platform for, searching for flights, right? I mean, so while we see that there are some platforms that try to build complementarities by, connecting a set of related activities, right? So mobility, right? I mean, or hospitality, right? Then we see that there are others that go the other direction, right? So they go very niche and they do very narrow part of those activities, right? And so this might speak to what you were also referring before, right? So, I mean, the quality. So they might invest in a superior platform design for just performing that activity, which we might perceive as a better quality, right? I mean, because now that platform does just that, right, as a job. And that might have actually greater returns because there is, greater specializations that, will lead, to recoup, right? I mean, some of those investments, because then they might become the default platform for that particular activity. And, the intuition I will get from your paper is that that's enough to justify, I mean, those ex ante investments, because then there can be, it can be large volume there just for this specialized activity. And so you don't need to think of, other, building a generic platform to attain those network effects. So you can, in other words, you can still compete also with the generalist platforms precisely because you specialize.
Yeah, so it's important to distinguish between two forms of specialization. So sometimes the specialization is used, in different ways depending on the context. So one way to think about specialization is the idea of essentially targeting a specific niche in the marketplace. So instead of having a generic platform that matches, that essentially sells books and, like Amazon, tuxedos and whatnot, and, specialize towards something very specific, such as booking flights, right? So that's one way to specialize. Our paper doesn't look specifically in that, in the context of competitive positioning and specializing in that, in the product space. The way we look at the specialization is specialization when in systems. So when you have a set of activities that are complementary, and essentially you decide to allocate your resources in one very specific set of activities. So just to give you an example, so one very big company these days is Stripe, which is a company that processes payments. So this is a company that essentially the average consumer doesn't know, but enters cut it across several digital ecosystems. The same goes with Twilio, which is a company that sends messages. I think when you have security issues online. So this is a company that specializes in one activity that cut it across several ecosystems. And so this is not a company that chooses a specific market niche. This is a company that chooses a specific layer in the vertical stack. So in the stack of activities that can be performed by several companies in order to produce a good or service. Now, with that in mind, if I were to answer your question, which is more about specializing in the marketplace or specializing in terms of positioning, it's an interesting question. I haven't thought deeply about this. My reaction to this would be that companies that target smaller markets will be the companies that are more likely to grow by diversifying or vertically integrating, simply because the market is smaller and they may reach the level of saturation that we were mentioning earlier faster. And that will lead to these companies to grow in adjacent activities. Said that, everything is possible. It is possible that something very insignificant like very short videos, like what TikTok does, right? So that could be something that looks very insignificant at the beginning, and then it could become like quite sensation. So it's difficult to say. But yeah, so what you just said earlier, it's possible, right? So it's possible that by specializing in one specific market niche and understanding that this niche if stretched globally, can actually lead to a very big market. Could give incentives to invest in quality, could create incentive to segment the market in different ways. And essentially we would observe a growth, right, where companies specialize in different niches, in different activities, and keep growing internationally, right? So that's in that respect, it seems to be kind of a plausible scenario. Now, of course, I haven't looked at the details of this. It's very difficult for me to make predictions, but there are different forces at play here.
Yeah, so my point, and thank you for clarifying. I mean, the different way of specializing. One has to do, as you said, right? I mean, in terms of demand side, if you want, right? So consumer-facing type of activities, right? So what is valuable for the consumer point of view, right? I mean, in its customer journey, while your paper is more focusing on the, I would say, supply side. I mean, so from the organizing principle. So what are the set of activities where it makes sense for an organization to invest, as then because you might think that might be complementarities also in terms of the capabilities that you need to develop to manage those activities, right? And so you keep all of the organizations.
I would like to give a concrete example just to make it clear, right? So Ferrari specializes in sports cars, right? While Volkswagen produces all sorts of cars, including sports cars. So it's more of a generalist player. At the same time, and so this is kind of the specialization that we observe from Ferrari is a positioning type of specialization, meaning that Ferrari is targeting a specific niche in the marketplace. At the same time, both Ferrari and Volkswagen use Brembo for brakes, right? So this is Brembo specializes in one activity in the value chain, in the ecosystem of producing cars, right? So our paper is more about companies like Brembo rather than companies like Ferrari, so to speak.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for bringing, an example of a company that is very dear to my heart. My question is, how do we think, though, about this relationship between, supply and demand as well, right? I mean, so meaning your take, right, that is more on an organizational standpoint, and then, the competition, right? I mean, understanding of these issues, which is more looking at the market side, right? I mean, and sometimes, I would say disregarding key aspects, right? I mean, on the supply side, the organizational aspects, right, that we management scholars particularly focus on. And so, my point, how do we reconcile maybe, this positioning related, sort of specializations versus, the organizing based, specialization. And when thinking about, competition, right? I mean, again, it's speculative. I'm asking you, to kind of reflect upon this, but, forward looking.
No, it's a very good question. So I thought about this, even, en passant at least at some point. And these are very good questions, right? So the first point that you raised, which I think is something that we discovered along the ways as we were writing the paper, is that it's very difficult to distinguish between the properties of a technology and the market in which this technology is used, right, to instantiate a value proposition. So generally, we think of economies of scale as a property of a technology, while in fact, you don't see technologies with economies of scale in markets that are small, because nobody will invest in those technologies. So, there is always a duality between market and resources, and the value of a resource depends on how it is used, right? So it's kind of obvious, right? But it's very difficult to distinguish between the properties of the technology and the market in which the technology is being used. The other thing is, for instance, if we're looking at scaling, we cannot just focus on one side, the technology side or the market side. Because if we are in the presence of a technology that has economies of scale, and at the same time, this technology is used in a small market, okay, which shouldn't happen to begin with, but let's assume that it happens, okay? Then the demand side of the equation is going to constrain the growth of the company, right? So at some point, because the market is small, right, the company reaches a limited point of saturation and therefore has to expand in an adjacent industry. So Similarly, if the market is very large, but the technology doesn't exhibit economies of scale, so and there are industry like that, like let's say concrete or other types, then the market, even though could in principle be a global market, is going to look very fragmented. And companies are not going to grow the same way we would expect them to grow if they combine both economies of scale on the supply side and economies of scale on the demand side. So really, there is a duality there between market and resources, and a good strategy, a good policy, right, governmental policy, and so on, should take account both sides of the equation.
Thanks. I mean, so that brings me to another question. I mean, this is a $1 million question. Okay, so if you answer correctly, then you win the jackpot.
Okay, I'm looking for the one.
Okay, so focus. Be super focused now. Okay, so as you might know, in the recent regulations of the European Union on Digital Markets Act, right? So we have this concept of core platform services, right? And then there's a list of what those are for digital firms and digital business models. And then the Digital Markets Act goes with a list of prohibitions, if you want, of what companies should not do if they operate this services, or should do. Okay, now some of those provisions, right? I mean, they kind of push forward the idea of silos, right? I mean, that this company should not expand or aggregate, for instance, data across a number of these different core platform services, but they should actually just stick to the core. And I think that the underlying reasoning behind that is they don't want this company to exploit kind of monopoly power that derives from these conglomerates, right, from digital conglomerates. So while instead, I mean, again, your research points to the fact that the monopoly power is coming mainly from the specializations on core, right? I mean, activities. So my question, the 1 million question is, and let me characterize, right? So there are some people, right? I mean, that they say, oh, this is going to be bad because then you can destroy some value creation opportunities because, from those data aggregations, there is information processing that then is released back into the ecosystem. And so more innovations can happen precisely because there is someone that, internalize these externalities that comes from information. Others say, well, no, that's too optimistic a view, because the platform just exploits this information and therefore, right, this gives the platform even more power. And therefore, the return from this public good are just going to the private, firm, right? I mean, they're not going to be shared. So, there's more potential damage than the benefits to attain. Which justify this idea of creating silos, right? I mean, so confining at least, right? I mean, the power of the firm. Is this what we have to promote, or how do you see this?
I thought a bit, and so one way to think about it is like a naive way. So let's assume that what my paper suggests is correct, right? So, which is again, it's open to question. But let's say if these companies do create more value, right? So the most value by focusing in their core activity, which seems to be happening in any way. This seems to be a smart policy, meaning that if there are benefits to specialization and this company grow by specializing in one key activity, then chances are that when they mix and match data across fields, that could open the door for something that is not necessarily efficient, right? So there's always the question, why are they doing it? What's the point? What is the value added of this mixing and matching, right? So if the paper were to be taken seriously and applied to these cases, then I think it sounds like a smart policy. Now, having said this, when it comes to innovation, for instance, right? So innovation often is the result of recombination. So it's the combination of different elements. It could come from the combination of different data sets. So that's a different question, right? So if we look at this from a very static point of view, then probably the policy makes perfect sense. If we look at this from the point of view of the potential for innovation, that's a different story, no? So the question is it possible for these companies to combine data in any way? Do they have to be more transparent? So the policy shouldn't necessarily hamper the long-term innovation potential, right, of any company, because that's, of course, creates value for the economy as a whole, right? So are there ways to address this? So that's a question I will ask to the policymaker.
Yes, correct. So one last point, which has to do, again, with this, how do we best combine, right? I mean, different, aspects, right? Or different potential objectives, right? I mean, benefits for society, which is, as in this case, I mean, the ability to keep innovating or enabling the economy to do that, which is more long-term and dynamic, with the static aspect that right now that company enjoying large benefits out of this process, right? Is interoperability, right? Which is another aspect, right? I mean, on the potential answer to some of those issues.
When it comes to, let's say, liberalizing the access to the data of these companies, right? So there are different things to consider. So we were mentioning earlier that one of the reasons why these companies invest so heavily in the platforms, in the quality of the products, is related to the appropriability that they have, right? So meaning that they invest X because they expect to leverage this asset across many users. And therefore, appropriability is an issue, meaning that companies essentially see the benefits of their investment spread across many industries and many players. Then that's going to create some free riding problems, reduce the incentives to invest, and it's not necessarily a good thing. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that when there are these big learning curves, scale generally comes with learning curves, comes with path dependency. So essentially, these companies operate at the top of an ivory tower. And it's very difficult for other companies to imitate or copy everything they do, right? So even if the data was shared, it's not clear that the algorithms will lose their value, right? So there are other elements that could play a role here. And knowing exactly how these trade-offs may flesh out, right, in practice it's a difficult exercise. So one has to look a little bit in case by case. But I think there are arguments on both sides of the border, right? Meaning that on one end, I can see why some people will argue for appropriability, right? Allowing this company to appropriate the returns on investments. On the other end, there are also arguments that go along the lines of, these companies have other assets that help them exploit their other resources, and therefore sharing is not a big deal, right? So sharing information.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Gigi, for this. This was super interesting, and this was a conversation with Gianluigi Giustiziero from IE Business School, mainly inspired by his recent research published in the Strategic Management Journal, Hyperspecialization and Hyperscaling, a resource-based theory of the digital firm, written with co-authors Tobias Kretschmer, Deepak Somaya, Brian Wu. It was a super interesting, and so thank you very much for sharing this on the Digital Markets Competition Forum.
Thank you, Carmelo. The pleasure is all mine. Thanks so much for having me.